The Mara Salvatrucha gang, or MS-13 as it's better known, emerged in LA in the 1980s, after Salvadoran immigrants moved to the US following the Central American Civil Wars. Over the decades, the group grew to become a more typical organized crime gang, dealing in illegal activities, wreaking havoc on everyday communities, and expanding their gang beyond California. In recent months, it has risen to even further prominence after US President Donald Trump's administration declared it a foreign terrorist organization and promised to crack down on its rampant violence. Join us for this documentary as we examine the dark world of Mara Salvatrucha, LA's most brutal export. In 2011, National Geographic wrote that many original Mara Salvatrucha gang members were former guerrilla fighters who brought their war experience and a hardened attitude towards life and death, with several journalists parroting this line of explanation in the following months and years. David Froome, a senior editor at The Atlantic, echoed similar sentiments by claiming that MS-13 had been established by former guerrillas to protect themselves and earn a living. However, this tale of the gang's origins has long since been debunked. The group actually has its roots in LA in the 1980s. Following numerous violent civil wars which ravaged Central America throughout the decade, many Salvadorans fled to the US illegally, as they were unable to obtain asylum seeker status, and as a result, became undocumented immigrants upon arriving across the border. Many of these Salvadorans settled in large cities that already had swells of immigrant populations, such as Los Angeles, where they tended to congregate in neighborhoods like Pico Union, Westlake, and Koreatown. Many officials in the US government had no interest in accepting Salvadoran refugees, claiming that most were not fleeing in fear of their lives, but that they were looking for better opportunities. One senator, Alan Simpson, was a strong supporter of this argument, claiming that things in El Salvador were on the up and up, and that citizens of the country should have no fear of returning home. But this simply isn't true. Civil war continued to rage throughout the 80s, and the difficult political climate continued to pose a threat to native Salvadorans. It would not be until 1991 that fairer treatment was given to such individuals by the US government, following numerous lawsuits, including American Baptist Churches versus Thornburg, which lasted 6 years before a settlement was reached. Even after Salvadorans were allowed to apply for asylum, though, many were still left vulnerable to exploitation. According to Jose Miguel Cruz, an expert in transnational gangs and the director of research at the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University, MS-13 was formed by the children of those Salvadorans who fled the Civil War. These original members didn't, in fact, practice violence and aggression regularly. Instead, they were young people who built a strong foundation of friendship and solidarity over their shared love of metal music, marijuana, and a desire to belong somewhere in a foreign country. The gang's famous hand sign, where the forefinger and pinky are extended, traces back to the devil's horn symbol commonly used by heavy metal fans. Even today, the group mostly consists of Salvadorans, Salvadoran Americans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, Mexicans, and other Central and South Americans. On top of this, many targets of their violence are fellow South and Central American immigrants, and the vast majority are minors. Minors are also members of the gang, with many participating in brutal and violent crimes that often lead them to serve decades-long jail sentences. Part of the reason that youths were brought into MS-13 originally was that many were unable to attend school due to the reluctance of school districts to admit them, leaving many of them at home and unattended with little to do. The majority of members are recruited while on their way to school, church, or work, and they are often coerced into joining. Similarly, young people in trouble with the law are often pressured and intimidated into joining a gang while incarcerated. It has also been observed that a large proportion of recruits have their loved ones threatened if they do not cooperate. In many factions of the group, potential recruits are beaten for 13 seconds as part of the initiation process. This ritual is known as jumping in. The name Mara Salvatrucha breaks down to a combination of Mara, meaning gang, Salva, meaning Salvador, and Trucha, which roughly translates to street smarts. The 13 in MS-13 represents the position of the M in the alphabet. The gang began morphing into a more criminal organization sometime in the 1990s, with some crediting racism and persecution for its shift towards crime and violence. Others, like journalist Stephen Dudley, who is an investigator and analyst of organized crime, have noted that self-defense from such prejudices and criminal ambition also contributed to the change of MS-13 from a so-called stoner gang to one of rampant violence. According to Central American news outlet El Faro, the group's shift towards aggression and subsequent venture into illegal activities was due in large part to the leadership of Ernesto Deras. During the Salvadoran Civil War, Deras was a member of the Salvadoran Special Forces and was trained by the U.S. Green Berets. He became the leader of an MS-13 faction in 1991 after fleeing to LA, where he put his military training to use to improve the group's operations. He was well informed about assembling and disassembling weapons, strategic retreats, ambushes, defensive strategies, and the importance that small units can play in a much larger battle. Deras's faction, known as the Fulton Gang, was reportedly the only one operating out of the entire San Fernando Valley in California while he was at the helm. They were also the lowest group on the food chain, meaning that they were essentially a target for other gangs in the area, and they often resorted to heavy violence in order to prevent their own annihilation. Reportedly, the Fulton faction is the only known group that requires potential members to carry out a murder to join it. For a time, members of MS-13 were allied with those of 18th Street, another LA-based street gang whose members hail from Mexico and Central America, as well as the US itself. It was formed in the Rampart neighborhood of the city in the 1960s by Mexican Americans and other immigrant youths who were not allowed into other gangs due to their background. A former member of 18th Street told El Faro that the two groups would hang out regularly at parties, joking around and poking fun at one another. They shared some of the same territory and seemed to live in peace for years until trouble began brewing within an MS-13 faction named the King Boulevard Locos. Former MS-13 member Alex Sanchez told El Faro that a fight broke out over a young woman between a member of King Boulevard Locos and 18th Street. The altercation left 4 dead, according to another former member. Some reports note that it was the death of one MS-13 member as a result of the fight, which led to a breakdown in the relationship of the two groups. However, even the aforementioned former members of the group believe that there was something more to the dissolution of the alliance, although nobody knows for sure what the truth of the matter is. Following the end of the Salvadoran Civil War in 1992, the U.S. began to deport many Salvadoran ex-convicts back to their homeland. In a piece for the LA Times, writers Robert Lopez, Rich Connell, and Chris Crowell have argued, however, that deportation has not lessened the influence of MS-13, but instead allowed them to expand in Central America and then back into other parts of the U.S. Strongholds have been established in the likes of Washington, D.C., while prisons are almost like communication hubs where deported leaders can speak with faction members all across the country. Those deported simply recruit in their home country, often leading to the formation of organized crime in areas where it previously had no presence. It has also been argued that the Civil War itself made Salvadorans vulnerable to recruitment and exploitation by such gangs, as the country was subject to torture, abuse, and other human rights violations during the 12-year conflict. On top of this, MS-13 was able to flourish in part thanks to a delay by the right-wing government at the time to form a proper police unit. The ruling party, the Nationalist Republican Alliance, was ordered to cease using its military as a police force as part of the Chapultepec Peace Accords, but the government delayed the formation of a real police organization, and when it was finally put together, many of its members were integrated from the military, meaning that numerous high-ranking individuals in the police force were known war criminals. Adding to all of this, MS-13 members in the country were able to seize unclaimed weapons left over from the conflict and began trafficking them. Even today, arms trafficking remains one of the group's main sources of revenue. The vast majority of MS-13 members are impoverished young men and teens who have troubled home lives or other circumstances, from homelessness, family estrangement and abuse, to participation in petty criminal activity such as theft and minor drug dealing. The gang often makes bases out of abandoned buildings in urban areas, which are known as destroyers. These establishments are used for a whole host of activities, from drug dealing to group meetings to parties. Those who work outside of the group are often in low-paying jobs like delivery and hospitality, though some take more manual careers, such as those in construction and landscaping. False documents are often used to help them secure employment. Perhaps one of the most recognizable rituals of MS-13 is their prominent tattoos. Members often brand themselves with inked words and images, including MS, Salvatrucha, devil horns, and the name of their faction. Although facial tattoos were a prominent part of the group's identity in the years following its formation, this has since been scaled back as it makes members more identifiable to law enforcement and witnesses. The MS-13 gang is famously violent, which has helped the cruelest of members be recruited into drug cartels to participate in the Mexican drug war. Officials believe that MS-13 seek to become a national brand, on par with the likes of the mafia or the Mexican drug cartels themselves. They have also noted that the group has seen some growth over the last decade, adding that it now has a presence in over 40 U.S. states, though its grip is often centered on small, concentrated communities. The violence that members enact is often done so very publicly. Infanticide and femicide are very common amongst the group, and notably, El Salvador has some of the highest rates of femicide in the world. In 2017, it was at the top of the list, and the country had some of the lowest conviction rates for such crimes, with only 5% of femicide cases resulting in a conviction. Like with many organized crime gangs, women are not seen as human beings but rather objects to be abused, exploited, and violated. A report by the BBC in April of 2017 touched on the case of two young MS-13 members, 22-year-old Miguel Alvarez Flores and 18-year-old Diego Hernandez Rivera, both of whom were arrested and charged in Houston, Texas, for kidnapping 3 teenage girls between the ages of 14 and 16, holding them hostage, and sexually assaulting them before shooting one of the girls dead. The pair reportedly laughed and waved at the cameras during their court appearance. An FBI gang specialist noted that the group's motto is, "Kill, rape, control." Revenge is also a core tenet of the group's philosophy, with violent retributions being doled out for even the most minor infractions. The smallest of slights can lead to the targeting of not just a perceived enemy, but that enemy's family, friends, and even neighbors. In the aforementioned BBC report, it was noted that 2 teen girls, 15-year-old Nisa Mickens and 16-year-old Kayla Cuevas, were killed by MS-13 members with machetes and baseball bats while walking around Long Island in 2016. The attack was reportedly in retaliation for what was described as a minor dispute, according to the police. Similarly, 2 more gang members were charged that same month when a fellow MS-13 member was murdered because he allegedly violated gang protocol. MS-13 is involved in a whole range of illegal activity, from drug and human smuggling to dealing in firearms to racketeering, murder, child prostitution, and extortion. According to information obtained by El Faro following a large-scale police operation, the gang's annual revenue is around $31.2 million, mostly made from drugs and extortion. In 2021, Honduran native Yulan Adonai Archaga Carayas was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list after being charged with racketeering conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns, and conspiracy to possess machine guns. A reward of $5 million is currently available for information leading to his arrest. Carayas is believed to be the leader of the gang's faction in Honduras, and he is, at the very least, a known drug lord. Authorities allege that he provides drugs, money, and weapons to MS-13 members in the U.S., and that he is responsible for ordering the murders of several rival gang members. Over the years, dozens of MS-13 members have been charged and convicted in connection with the most heinous of crimes. In May of 2005, 22-year-old Oscar Grande and 26-year-old Ismael Cisneros were found guilty on 5 different counts, including murder conspiracy and retaliating against an informant after they murdered 17-year-old Brenda Paz, who was 4 months pregnant at the time. Brenda was stabbed 16 times, and her body was left on a riverbank in Shenandoah County, Virginia, on July 13, 2003. She was murdered because she was scheduled to testify for the prosecution against various gang members in Virginia and Texas later that year, and had reportedly voluntarily left the witness protection program just 3 weeks before she was killed. A third defendant, 21-year-old Dennis Rivera, was acquitted on all counts but was already serving life in prison for another murder, while a fourth defendant was also acquitted. One of the most infamous cases that MS-13 were involved in was the murder of 28 people and the wounding of 14 more after gang members shot up a public bus using assault rifles. On December 23, 2004, the bus was driving through a busy neighborhood in the city of Chamalacon, Honduras, when it was surrounded by armed men who fired into the vehicle. The president at the time, Ricardo Maduro, described the event as a barbaric and cowardly act. The bus was reportedly forced to pull over to the side of the road at 7:40 p.m. before it was surrounded by vehicles from which emerged the armed men. 16 citizens died on the scene, while another 12 perished in the hospital. 16 of those killed were women, while 6 were children, and another 6 were men. Following the assault, the gunmen reportedly left behind a note claiming that they represented a guerrilla group believed to be defunct, the Cinchonero People's Liberation Movement, which had not seen any activity since the 1980s. The note alleged that the act of violence was in response to the decision made by the Honduran government to reintroduce the death penalty and also challenge various prominent politicians who were vocally opposed to organized crime in the country. In the hours after the slaughter, the military was dispatched to the streets in search of the killers, and the following day, it was announced that 9 members of MS-13 had been charged in connection with the attack. In 2008, 2 MS-13 gang members, Darwin Alexis Ramirez and Juan Carlos Miranda, were convicted of 27 murders, 10 attempted murders, being gang members and carrying illegal weapons. They were given sentences totaling 822 years, but would only serve 40, the maximum term allowed. Another member named Hebert Anibal Rivera was arrested over the assault after fleeing to Texas, while yet another, Juan Bautista Jimenez, who was believed to have masterminded the entire crime, was killed in prison, allegedly by fellow MS-13 members. Meanwhile, on June 22, 2008, 49-year-old Tony Bologna, along with his sons, 20-year-old Michael and 16-year-old Matthew, were shot and killed near their residence in the Excelsior district of San Francisco, shortly after returning from a family event in Fairfield. Both Tony and Michael died at the scene, while Matthew died 2 days later in the hospital. A third son was wounded in the shooting. Authorities soon discovered that 21-year-old Edwin Ramos, an MS-13 member, was responsible for the crime, and he was subsequently arrested. Like many members of the group, Ramos was born in El Salvador in 1986, where he was raised by his grandmother. It wasn't until he was 14 years old in 2000 that he was able to enter the U.S. on a temporary visa so that he could be reunited with his family. But after the visa expired, the teenager stayed in the country anyway. At some point, he became involved with the gang, and in April of 2004, he was given probation after he was convicted of assault and being a member of a gang, following an attack in which he beat up a man on a bus in October of the previous year. Just 4 days after he was sentenced, Ramos assaulted a pregnant woman and her brother. He was convicted of robbery a short time later and spent his probation at a juvenile delinquent center named Log Cabin Ranch, which is now closed. Though Ramos was denied further residency in the U.S., he wound up marrying a U.S. citizen, and afterwards, he applied for permanent residency and began working in construction. An informant told investigators in 2006 that Ramos had shot and killed a member of another gang, but he was not apprehended until March 2008 when he was found driving a vehicle with illegally tinted windows and no license plate. He was also carrying a passenger who had a gun that had been used in a double homicide. He wasn't held in custody as there was insufficient evidence to link him to the gun, and he was ultimately released. It is believed that Ramos murdered the Bologna family as part of a road rage incident. He was identified by the family's surviving son and was given 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. Notably, the violence of MS-13 members and their desire for retribution is not limited to police, civilians, or those from other gangs. Many times, it applies to their own family, including wives, girlfriends, and even children, though much of this is to be expected as we have already established their high rates of femicide and infanticide. In 2013, 22-year-old Juan Elias Garcia was convicted of the murder of his 19-year-old girlfriend, Vanessa Argueta, and her son, 2-year-old Diego Torres, which took place in 2010 on New York's Long Island. It is believed that Garcia killed the pair because Vanessa had disrespected the gang by sending rivals to attack him. Vanessa was shot in the head and chest, while her toddler was shot twice in the head. Following the murder, Garcia fled to El Salvador, where he remained on the run for 4 years and was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. However, he ultimately surrendered to authorities in Nicaragua and was extradited to the U.S. for prosecution. Garcia claimed that after he and Vanessa had argued, he'd been threatened by rival gang members who knew information that he believed she had given them. He subsequently obtained permission from his faction leader to retaliate, with the help of 2 accomplices. According to the FBI, Vanessa was lured to a wooded area with her son. She was killed first, which led Diego to begin crying. He was shot, but the bullet did not kill the little boy, who clung onto his mother's leg. The second shot was directed at his head, killing him instantly. Garcia's 2 accomplices were convicted for their part in the crime, while their leader, Heriberto Martinez, was also apprehended. He was given 3 life terms plus 60 years for a variety of crimes, including murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. A more recent but prominent crime committed by MS-13 was an assault that took place in MacArthur Park, Los Angeles, in 2020. Daniela Hernandez was enjoying the sunny weather one day in April when she was approached by a man and a woman who told her they ruled the park as they were members of MS-13. Daniela was a Salvadoran immigrant who'd entered the U.S. illegally, so she was well aware of the gang's reputation. The pair demanded $80 a week so that she could be left alone. The group would later refer to these weekly fees, which they collected from shopkeepers and vendors, as well as from those offering illicit services such as sex and drugs, as taxes, which they accepted in turn for leaving the payee to go about their business unbothered. Daniela told the MS-13 pair that she couldn't afford to pay more than $20 a week. The 2 members agreed to the fee, but said that it would need to be paid every week, regardless of whether or not she even used the park. She later told the media that she believed she was singled out because she was a transgender woman, and the gang believed that all transgender women who used the park were doing so to solicit clients. Daniela noted that she was not a sex worker and simply enjoyed the park. For 6 months, Daniela paid $80 a month to MS-13, often to young men carrying weapons such as baseball bats. However, early into the pandemic, she lost her job, which made making ends meet very difficult. Sometimes she asked her friends to lend her the money to pay the $20 a week fee. Though she considered going to the police, she feared being deported because she was an illegal immigrant. In September that year, MS-13 made headlines again when they nearly stabbed a transgender woman to death inside the park. She too had been paying the gang $20 a week until she decided that she was no longer going to. She was sitting in the park one night when she was stabbed repeatedly until she fell to the ground, where she was kicked in the head. She managed to escape to the metro, where she boarded the first available train. She was found by police at Union Station, still bleeding from 5 stab wounds. Daniela believed that she was safe because she was still managing to make her payments. However, one day, after paying $40 to cover the previous and current weeks, she was told that one of the gang members wanted to have a word. At 9 p.m. one October night, she was approached by two men as she sat on a park bench. They told her they were MS-13 members and that they no longer wanted her at the park, referring to her by a Spanish homophobic slur. A woman was approaching Daniela from behind, and she wrapped an arm around her throat and slashed at it with a knife. She was held down as the two men stabbed her in the chest, abdomen, and arms. Police later found her in the grass, covered in blood. She'd been stabbed 13 times and had a 5-inch slash across her neck, narrowly missing her carotid artery. Authorities would identify one of the men Daniela dealt with and who assaulted her that night as 22-year-old Javier Treman Rodriguez. He pleaded not guilty to extortion and attempted murder. The same charges were laid against another member, 24-year-old Donovan Fonseca, who also pleaded not guilty. In July of 2020, brand new terrorism charges were laid against a member of MS-13 named Armando Diaz, a Honduran native who lived in the U.S. for some time before returning to his home country in 2016. The Washington Post noted that such charges had never before been laid against a member of the group. Former Attorney General William Barr noted during the announcement that 21 other suspected MS-13 gang members had been apprehended across New York and Nevada. MS-13 is still active today. In 2009, it was believed to have between 30,000 and 50,000 members globally, around 8 to 10,000 of whom reside in the U.S. It is one of the largest Hispanic street gangs currently operating in the U.S. and is active in as many as 42 of its 50 states. Meanwhile, it still has strong operations in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, with the Salvadoran police database recording over 120,000 alleged gang members, potential members, and collaborators following the 2023 State of Exception gang crackdown led by President Nayib Bukele. MS-13 isn't without its opponents. In 2004, the FBI created the MS-13 National Gang Task Force, which organized cooperation between relevant law enforcement agencies in the hopes that by working together and sharing information, they could dismantle the gang once and for all. Although numerous Salvadoran government administrations attempted to crack down on violent organized crime groups, none have proven to be useful, with some experts even noting that such policies have served only to empower gangs in El Salvador. By January of 2025, meanwhile, the State of Exception crackdown had apprehended over 80,000 Salvadorans. Around 8,000 were released after being found innocent, while 15,000 alleged gang members were subsequently imprisoned at the recently installed and highly controversial Terrorism Confinement Center, which has been repeatedly accused of human rights abuses and inhumane conditions. The gang began making headlines in the U.S. early this year, following the installation of the new U.S. administration headed by Donald Trump, whose government has been apprehending and detaining immigrants, both illegal and legal, since taking office in January. Trump has used MS-13 to fearmonger, often painting all illegal immigrants as MS-13 gang members who want to pour into and infest our country. However, research carried out by numerous experts shows that the vast majority of MS-13 members are based in their home countries, with a Florida International University study showing that 91% of imprisoned gang members in El Salvador in 2016 have never set foot in the U.S. Salvadorans who leave their home for the U.S. are often doing so in search of a better future, to obtain financial stability, and to avoid violence in their home country. They generally join large migration flows from Central America as opposed to leaving for the U.S. under the instruction of a gang. Similarly, Trump has stated time and time again that U.S. immigration laws and border controls are the reason that violent gangs can operate in the U.S. However, most MS-13 members in the U.S. were not gang members before entering the country, according to a study by Insight Crime and American University. Recruits are often living in troubled circumstances and poverty and have already been exposed to violence during their lifetime. The success of a gang is often dependent on such conditions, requiring civil unrest, economic hardships, and poor community support to fully flourish. Community services, the standard of education available, law enforcement policies, and one's social life and relationships all play a factor. As the worse these amenities and relationships are, and the less support people have, the more desperate they become, falling victim to the promises of gang recruiters and being easily exploited, pressured, and coerced. Research shows that investing in community resources and working with locals to address the problems that might push people into gang life is the best way to prevent such groups from taking hold. Transnational gang expert Jose Miguel Cruz has held up Homestead, Florida, as a strong example of a city that has avoided having issues with gang activity. Though it has a large Central American immigrant community, its strong and abundant resources for citizens have helped it avoid becoming significantly embroiled with MS-13, and the group has struggled to expand in the area. As well as using MS-13 as a whole to instill fear of immigrants into U.S. citizens, the Trump administration has also specifically targeted Salvadoran immigrants and justified their arrest by claiming that they are members of the notorious organization. The main example of this is the recent deportation of 30-year-old Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who grew up in El Salvador and illegally entered the U.S. around the age of 16 to avoid organized gang violence and threats. In 2019, an immigration judge granted him withholding of removal status, noting that he faced backlash and violence if he returned to his native country. With this status, Garcia was able to live and work legally within the U.S., as long as he checked in regularly with ICE every year to receive the appropriate permits, something he did without issue. At the time of his apprehension, he was living in Maryland with his wife and children, all of whom are American citizens. On March 15, 2025, Garcia was deported to El Salvador in an administrative error, after which he was imprisoned without trial in El Salvador's Terrorism Confinement Center, the same maximum security facility that now houses around 15,000 alleged MS-13 gang members. Notably, Garcia has never been convicted of a crime either in El Salvador or in the U.S. Though his case is the most prominent, he is not the only one this has happened to, as hundreds of immigrants have been jailed at the center without due process. When confronted by outraged citizens and reporters, the U.S. government alleged that Garcia is a member of MS-13, although the publicly available evidence is not overwhelming. In March of 2019, he and 3 other men were detained in Hyattsville, Maryland, when they were found loitering in the car park of a Home Depot. The men would later state they were looking for work. Police officers claimed that 3 of the men, including Garcia, were members of MS-13, detailing observations such as Garcia was wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie, which they claimed was indicative of the Hispanic gang culture. Gang expert Stephen Dudley stated that while it was true that the logo had become a stand-in of sorts for the MS-13's devil horn symbol, wearing a logo of a hugely popular sports team is not exclusive to gangs. Officers also claimed that they were advised by a proven and reliable source that Garcia was a member of MS-13's Western clique with the rank of Chequio, though Dudley had pointed out that there is no such rank, and Chequio is used to describe men who are yet to be initiated into the gang. Meanwhile, the Trump administration alleged that tattoos on Garcia's hands, a smiley face, a cross, a skull, and a marijuana leaf were gang symbols. Several experts have cast doubt on these claims, however. Though this publicly revealed evidence seems shaky, the judge who presided over his 2019 case claimed that based on confidential information, there was sufficient evidence to support the idea that Garcia is part of MS-13. For his part, both he and his wife have denied his involvement with the gang. According to reports of his early life in El Salvador, Garcia's mother, who ran her own business, was extorted for money and threatened that if she did not pay, her eldest son, Cesar, would be forced to join the 18th Street Gang. The group later threatened to kill him. As a result, the family hid Cesar before sending him to the U.S. After which point, the gang turned their attention to 12-year-old Garcia, who was repeatedly threatened and harassed by the group. He was sent to the U.S. to join his brother when he was 16 years old. In June of 2025, Garcia was returned to the U.S., where he is awaiting trial for charges of human smuggling. These charges refer to a 2022 traffic stop for speeding, during which Garcia was driving a vehicle with 8 others inside. As they had no luggage, the attending officer suspected that it was a case of human trafficking, although no charges were filed at the time. Garcia's wife told the media, "Kilmar worked in construction and sometimes transported groups of workers between job sites, so it's entirely plausible he would have been pulled over while driving with others in the vehicle." It has also been noted in newspaper reports that his wife had previously filed a protective order petition against him after noting that he'd assaulted her on multiple occasions. However, she publicly stated that she and Garcia were able to work through this situation privately as a family, including by going to counseling. She added that he was a loving partner and father. In mid-July, Garcia's lawyers asked a federal judge to issue at least a 72-hour hold so that he could not be immediately deported if he was released from prison in Tennessee. At the time of the writing of this script, there have been no further updates in the case. It is worth noting that despite the doctrine spread by the Trump administration, the group has not literally taken over U.S. cities. Notably, it's not even the biggest street gang in the country. It's only about 1/2 the size of the Bloods, 1/5 the size of the 18th Street Gang, and accounts for about 1% of total gang members in the U.S. Furthermore, though it has members in over 40 states, the communities it operates in are often small and concentrated. It's not as fast-growing and vast-spreading as some officials might have us believe. Former Attorney General Jeff Sessions once compared MS-13 to the likes of Colombian cartels and the Sicilian Mafia, but years of investigations into the group have concluded that its involvement in the drug trade is minimal, especially in comparison to these much bigger groups, which bring in tens of billions a year. In some cases, their activity is limited to controlling local markets. By all accounts, MS-13 has never had the political or economic influence needed to run large-scale operations, and, similarly, they have been unable to establish large and strong networks across the U.S. Much of their operations are controlled by individual faction leaders. The brutality of MS-13 has a tremendously large effect on those living in El Salvador, where locals have spent decades living in fear of being extorted, kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at the hands of MS-13 and 18th Street. This terror has prompted current President Nayib Bukele, who has been in the position since 2019, to launch a War on Gangs campaign, which led to the apprehension of tens of thousands of Salvadorans and numerous tense crackdown operations where the rights of citizens were suspended so that law enforcement could capture alleged gang members. Though such plots have seen a drop in the murder rate in El Salvador, it's worth noting that official figures exclude the number of people killed by security forces. Furthermore, in 2022, Reuters uncovered discrepancies over the number of bodies pulled from mass graves. An Amnesty International report from August 2022 observed that over 1% of the country's population was in prison, surpassing the U.S. as having the world's highest incarceration rate. They also noted that this iron fist approach took place once before between 2003 and 2004, and homicide rates dropped in the immediate aftermath. They rose sharply between 2004 and 2006. It seems entirely possible that a similar pattern will occur here. Amnesty International has been very critical of Bukele's government and its approach to organized crime, noting that for-profit prison schemes, like the one where the U.S. is currently paying El Salvador to house its accused deported gang members, are hardly a viable solution and do not fix the root of the problem. As we discussed earlier, the answers to organized crime are much more complex and require time, money, and community effort, rather than a removal of human rights and due process.